to the Thank God for Bitcoin podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jordan. Good to be here.
I realize, I'm sure did you ever imagine you'd be on a podcast called Thank God for Bitcoin? I'm sure it was on your bucket list. And so we can knock one off today. Um, so for those who aren't familiar with your work, Philip, why don't you just kind of give an overview of who you are and what you do?
Well, I guess by training, I'm an economist. I know you sent me a picture of my old book, which is kind of creepy. That was a long time ago now. That was 10
Right
years
here.
ago, more than 10 years ago. I wrote that book. So I was involved in the kind of how would you put it, like the critical economics movement after 2008,
Hmm.
rethinking economic theory and stuff like that. And then after that, I went into finance, investment finance, and I was there for nearly a decade, working as basically a macro strategist on a portfolio. I lived in America for a while, in Boston and in London. And since for the past few years, I've been basically working in and around policy. I'm currently working in foreign affairs in Hungary. I'm working for an international institute, so working on kind of geopolitical matters and so on. But I've always been interested in philosophy and stuff like that. It's always been a big interest of mine. It doesn't pay the bills, unfortunately, most of the time. So
Wait, you're
being a
telling me this for
macro,
the first time?
so exactly. So yeah, I mean I wrote this book, Collapse of Global Liberalism, and it's there's economics in there as well, but there's a bit of political philosophy and stuff like that. Been involved with the post-liberal thing for quite a while. When American Affairs, the journal, started, if you know it, Julius Krein and Gladden Papin started in 2016.
Mm.
I was a pretty early contributor, and I kind of hung around that circle, what would develop into the post-liberal circle. So I kind of I'm a bit of a known quantity, I'd say,
Yeah.
from the inception, but I only really started publishing under my own name on these issues the past couple of years, really.
Yeah. And so, okay, so this is your background. You study. You're an economist. You kind of start working, in all these different places in those capacities as an economist. So, what was kind of the impetus for the book on the Reformation and economics? I know. I believe I remember. Are you Roman Catholic?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I don't know if you meant to invoke the Reformation, but yeah, I mean, it was the first thing that having, as someone who's thought about a lot about these topics, I was interested just from that basis. So, was that a little tongue in cheek, or was that totally accidental?
I probably wasn't as Roman Catholic when I wrote the book, and I was
Okay.
being a little bit, but I knew enough about theological politics to
Sure.
think it was clever. I'd say Protestants will actually really appreciate the analysis. The kind of, I mean, the idea was basically that the economics profession was what the church was like when the Reformation happened, right?
Yep.
And I think even Roman Catholics are allowed admit that the church was in a pretty sorry state
Good.
around
There
the
we go.
time of the Luther and Calvin and so on.
Yep.
And it was kind of I actually don't agree with this now, but it was the Protestants made the claim that it was very intellectually flabby, that
Hmm.
that it was just justifying things for no reason. It was
Hmm.
justifying really corrupt practices in the church and giving these really abstract theological reasons for things that were obviously what we'd call grift nowadays.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it seemed to me that the economics profession were doing that too,
Yeah.
especially after 2008. I mean,
Yes.
basically
Yeah.
what happened with me was I was in college studying economics in Dublin, and on the weekends I was showing houses,
Yep.
property. My mother worked as a real estate agent, as you guys say in America. We call them
Yep.
auctioneers in Ireland.
Okay.
And so I was in college studying economics, and they were telling us there was no housing bubble. Of course, in Ireland there was the biggest housing bubble in world
Oh,
history.
really?
And
Holy cow.
I was showing houses on the weekend, and I was like, this is clearly I don't even know. I'm a stupid 18 or 19-year-old, but I can tell this is a bubble or there's
Wow.
something weird going on. So when it all crashed, I just thought this is complete nonsense.
Yeah.
How could these economists be teaching me all this rubbish, and then me seeing and being a stupid 18 or 19-year-old, not knowing anything about the world and just saying like something's fake here.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I was involved in some of I went and did a master's in very heterodox economics in a very obscure department in the UK in Kingston University. I thought it was
Okay.
great. I learned kind of all the Austrian and the Marxist and
Yep.
the post Keynesian and the mainstream stuff too. And the culmination of it all really was, I suppose, that book,
Yep.
which is now obviously heretical. From my perspective. No, I'm kidding. But I think I think most of it's still pretty valid. I was pretty young when I wrote it, so
Yep.
maybe there's a couple of regrets, but
Yeah. Do you mind me
I
asking
haven't
how old?
disowned it and I haven't changed my name. So
Yeah. How old were you when you wrote the book?
25,
Whoa.
young.
Okay. And so you self-published. I mean, that dude, just good on you
No,
for
it's
that.
Palgrave. No,
Okay,
no, it's
okay, no, you're
Palgrave
right. I'm so
Macmillan.
sorry, Palgrave. You're so right. I saw it was the what is it? It was just the citation in the beginning that you have. It's it's just you. It says the author 2016. But yeah, no. So congratulations on getting that done as a 25-year-old. That's impressive. um,
Yeah, it was published when I was 27, I think. Yeah.
okay. But you wrote it when you're 25. Okay. So why don't you just kind of give a brief introduction to the book, and then how I would love to know your evaluation of it here. Or what are we on? Like 9 years on from it. I know you said most of it stands. Like, are there things that you disagree with on it after you give kind of the intro to what was the project of the book?
Yeah, I mean the rhetorical tone I think might have been a little different if I wrote it now.
Yeah.
But the analogy is apt if
Yeah.
unless you're taking a very strong theological position on the Reformation.
Yeah.
The analogy is apt. I mean it's that's what the economics profession became. Effectively, what struck me about economics was two things basically.
Yeah.
And they really sounded like the things that some of the reformers were criticizing the church for back in the
Yeah.
Reformation period. The first one was that the actual foundations of the theology that they were putting forward, the economics abstract theory, the actual foundations were very poorly understood
Mm-hmm.
by the economists themselves. And this
Yep.
was basically because back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and maybe even into the 60s, the economists that were writing, putting down the foundations for what would become neoclassical economics, were quite broadly literate.
Mm-hmm.
They had an understanding at least of basic philosophy or basic social science methodology. Maybe they wouldn't know much about philosophy, but some of them did. Definitely going back to the earlier economists back at the turn of the 20th century and in the 1930s especially, they'd be very philosophically informed. I
Yep.
mean, John Maynard Keynes came out of the British idealist tradition of G. E. Moore and so on. So
Mm-hmm.
that's literally was his circles. And his students came out of the kind of Wittgenstein era and everything like that. So they were very philosophically informed. Even in the 40s, 50s, 60s, I think they all would have had to be at least like reasonably aware of methodological debates in social science.
Yeah.
And what struck me with the neoclassicals, the baby boomer generation of neoclassicals and younger, is that they had no idea of the foundation. So they had
Yeah.
these highly abstract theories like general equilibrium theory, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling, tons of stuff, even simpler models, ISLM. I know I sound like a complete nerd here, but all these things, like, these are abstract mathematical models, and I didn't think they even understood the foundations of these models.
Yeah.
I knew for a fact they had not read the literature on which these models were based. And
Yeah.
so you had this profession that spoke in these very abstract terms, but once you kind of dug in, read like what those models were actually all about, what the authors intended with them, you realized it was completely different
Yeah.
to what
Exactly.
these guys were talking about. And this obviously is exactly what the reformers were saying about the church.
Yeah.
They said, we've gone back to the church fathers and we found that you guys are wrong with it. So the analogy is pretty perfect. And then the second point is that they were using this ideology to cover up what was a rotten economy.
Yeah.
A rotten economy that had gone through two bubbles at that stage. It went through the dot-com bubble, and then it actually went through the savings and loan bubble before that in the 80s. But at least the dot-com bubble, and then the 2008 bubble, and it was hear no evil, see no evil, And they
Yeah.
didn't want to change any of their models. They came up with post hoc rationalizations
Yep.
of why these events took place. And so I think the basic analogy basically stood. And the book was basically about, like, what is with economic theory? What is it? Is it fit for purpose? What are the foundations of it? Are there alternative theories? And yeah, I think overall it was pretty successful. I could probably think about it and find some stuff that I kind of regret. Well, not
Yeah.
regret, but like I could probably improve on or something.
Yeah.
But I don't really intend I don't intend on writing an economic theory book like that again. I've
Yeah.
just finished a book with a demographer on the economics of demographic change.
Oh,
But
cool.
that's
Okay.
I mean, there's some economic theory in it for sure, but it's not a big T theory book in the way that Reformation was.
Sure.
So I don't know. I haven't really thought about it that much. I occasionally write pretty concrete economics theory articles. I wrote one on consumption for American
Okay.
Affairs recently,
Oh, cool.
and so on. So I still kind of do it, but I haven't really thought about the book in a couple of years till
Yeah.
people started pulling it off the bookshelf recently, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. So now
Oh,
again,
and
this.
just one more thing. It
Yeah.
inspired a bunch of people who, this is really interesting. It just came to me now. It inspired a bunch of people. I know this for a fact. I won't name who it is, but that are currently working on trade policy in the Trump administration.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. A bunch of post liberal types cottoned onto that book back about 8 years ago. It didn't sell very well. I mean, it's an academic book. It's
Yeah.
from an academic publisher.
Yeah.
But I did have people come up to me and were like, "Yeah, I read that book. Like, it was a big thing, whatever." So I think maybe it had a bit of an underground influence. But
Yeah.
if you look at it on its face, I think it got reviewed in the FT like badly or something. But if you look at it on its face, it didn't seem to have it didn't work. And the economics reform movement in general after 2008 was a miserable failure.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is one of these things where, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's so much that you just said, but you could go back to, I mean, yeah, central banking, right? The promise of central banking is we're not going to have any booms and busts anymore. You know, this is great news. we're not going to have
There
these
are
kind of-
more.
exactly. So now again, so our audience, we have a lot of people who are Austrian influenced, and so there's a lot of people who will hear you criticize central banking, and they'll go, "Oh, great." He's not a fan of Keynesianism, right? He's and then you read the intro and it's more complicated than that. So can you kind of talk about your relationship with Keynes and his line of thinking?
I'm a Keynesian economist, like 100%. I'm a Keynesian economist, and I know the Austrian monetary theory very well.
Yep.
I think I know it better than some Austrians. I'm not sorry, but I kind of do. I know the Austrian monetary theory very well, and I think it's a reasonably okay theory. It's a little bit literalistic, Austrian business cycle theory. I don't have a, but it's better than neoclassical theory.
Yeah.
I mean, it certainly is describing credit boom and bust cycles that are driven by lax monetary arrangements. But I mean, Hyman Minsky is a Keynesian economist, and he has a similar. You know, there's some Austrian theory in Hyman Minsky as well. I mean, I don't really think of these schools as necessarily competing
Hermetically
all the time.
concealed
And
or hermetically sealed things. Yeah.
no, and I think there's ideologies have been attached to the schools, like post-Keynesian economics, which I think I am a post-Keynesian economist, has been associated with Marxism of some sort. And a lot of post-Keynesians are Marxist.
Yeah.
A professor was a Marxist.
Yeah.
But I'm not a Marxist, so it's not. And then the Austrian stuff has become tied up with libertarianism.
Yeah.
But I don't think I actually know people I used to work with in finance who were Austrians, but in theory, but they were actually like Labour voters in the UK. So, like, I think that tying these schools to political ideologies is just not a good idea at all.
Yeah.
And I include neoclassical economics in that and everything. I think the alternative schools, Austrians, post-Keynesianism, and Marxism to a certain extent, they are the thing that they oppose is actually this technocratic scientism in the neoclassical doctrine, and that's what's really important to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and this, I mean, this is something that we talk about a lot. So the very first quote in the introduction is kind of where a lot of our audience and me myself, like where I have some objections to some of these things. So I'm just going to read it for us. It's from Johann Georg Heymann. For this prolepsis of being equal to God had blazed a trail for all philosophical knowledge and legislative justice. This forceful seizing was the first lie of the first attempt to displace our senses from simplicity in words and to oversalt the peace of God on earth to the debauched taste of reason. And so this idea of, I mean, this idea of like men trying to be God, you know, I think this is one of the big critiques that I would have, and I think a lot of our audience would have with the project of central banking. And so I think like one of the questions And I think that getting to the philosophical roots of a lot of these things, I think it's much something I'm much more interested in. Which again, it's not going to pay the bills necessarily, but like just getting at the root of, I think like one of the conclusions that I came to, or the realizations that I had, was like so much of all of these systems and your idea of what makes a good system or what makes a bad system is rooted in your understanding of what it means to be human, and of like how, what level of control you think that humans are supposed to, like it would be good, like first of all that it is possible for humans to have, and then also that it would be good for humans to have over, over these different elements of their life, including economics. And so I would love to kind of get like, how do you think about what are your grounding principles for thinking about economics? Maybe we'll start there.
Well, I mean that kind of touches on it, right? The neoclassicals all assume like omniscient knowledge
Yeah.
on behalf of something or other. It's not even clear. Like these, I say it in the book over and over again. These are theological doctrine. They're
Yeah.
weird, like secular theologies. A lot of these
Yes.
equilibrium principles. I wrote a paper later on. You might be able to track it down in an Inference Review called "The Miracle of General Equilibrium," and I did a mathematical calculation on how probable it would be to achieve a general equilibrium. I think it's the first time it's ever been done. I still don't think I got credit for it. But anyway, whatever. I guess economics theories debate isn't actually interesting anymore or something, even though everybody uses it. But the point is, I called it the miracle of general equilibrium quite purposefully. It was miracle like probabilities, it was like some completely impossible number that was like a million times the number of seconds since the Big Bang or something. It was not stuff. And that's basically the whole thing. Look, you have this again similarly in the Hayekian tradition and the Keynesian tradition, a notion of uncertainty and limited knowledge, that both of those hold to it. And that's why I think these ideological divisions are largely fake.
Mm.
Keynes writes about limitations on knowledge. He writes a book on probability before he writes any famous economic work, before he even writes The Economic Consequences of Peace, which makes him famous. He writes a book on probability that was very well received by the Cambridge philosophers like Bertrand Russell and so on. Not that I have a huge amount of time for Bertrand Russell, but I mean, he's a real guy, I guess, and he was a good mathematician. And Keynes writes a book on probabilities that's still widely ignored. And it's a really interesting book on actual capacity to apply probabilities. We don't have to get into statistical arguments and so on. I'm fascinated by them, econometrics, all that. But the foundations of statistical science are based on probabilities, and that is not just economics and econometrics and pretty much all social science. It's also medicine. It's also epidemiological studies are based on this. I think we came to realize that over the year 2020, 2021 about some of these statistical issues. But I'm actually pretty good at that kind of thing, and I know the foundations of it probably better than most who are in it, who again, like these guys in economics, I think often they just haven't thought about the philosophical basis of what they're doing, epistemological basis of what they're doing. But it's hard to get knowledge of the world. I mean, that's the kind of key takeaway. It's very, very hard to get knowledge of the world. I mean, getting knowledge of the world in a scientific manner requires repeatable controlled experiments, as I talked about in Reformation. And in that, you're even still dealing with a probability. Sometimes, like, you can run an experiment 5 times, and you can be like, okay, well, we've proved it. And then the 6th time, it doesn't work. I mean, that's actual science. Statistical inference is different. I'm not saying it's unscientific, but it's something different. And I think people in financial markets are most attuned to this, and even in Bitcoin markets, because you lose when you get it wrong. And so when you've had your ass kicked a couple of times in a market, you're like, I'm not going to be so certain before. I remember just an anecdotal story. When I first went into finance, I was in kind of a quantitative driven firm. And I had, I was working with all the quants and stuff, and I put together this really good recession model that I could backfit, and it would tell me about market downturns and all sorts of things. And it was all very sophisticated and everything like that. And I showed it to my boss, who'd been in the game for about 15 years. And he just laughed at me and he said, that's not going to work. But I said, hang on a minute. Look, it's back tested. I ran a T-stat on it. Like, it's very improbable that this isn't fitted properly, blah, blah, blah. And he just kind of snickered at me. And he said, okay, well, keep an eye on it. Of course, it completely failed. Of course, it completely failed. But by statistical standards,
Yeah.
it was a well-fit model,
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah. So the thing is, like, I had a sense of it even before I went into finance. I got much more of a sense of it when I was in finance. It's really hard to get knowledge of the world. It's
Yeah.
really, really difficult. Unless you have a controlled experimental environment, which is almost impossible to achieve outside of like physics and chemistry. To a certain extent, biology. Biology is not even as hard a science as some people think it is.
Yep.
Medicine isn't. It's hard to gain knowledge of the world. And so people who think that they have a knowledge of a system like an economy down to a T, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about
It's
your claims there.
Yeah, it's insane, to be honest with you. Like, and it's a similar. There's like similar problems. Or a related issue would be there's been people who've talked about the difficulty of police work in the age of CSI, because like everyone thinks about like forensic evidence and they're like, oh, this is the strongest evidence, and they act like even this like this is evidence that's beyond interpretation. If we have this level of evidence, we know for certain that these things. And then it's tended to like denigrate things like circumstantial evidence. People don't appreciate and value it as much. And so if you don't have the silver bullet, if you can't see it when it happened, or this level of evidence, then you can't have the degree of certainty. And so it's really just it's the elevation of things like science, or like the discipline of science over the discipline of something like history, right? Like these have two different evidentiary standards that are both really important and both really valid, but they're just very different. And so there you have, to your point, you have people who have come to appreciate one at the expense of the other, and they don't realize that these are two hands on the same body. You need both of them. You can't just say one is more important than the other. Like they do different things, and so we really do need both of them. And so yeah, I think that we've been very ill served throughout the last, I don't know, you could, whatever time period you want to put on, 100 years, over like the secularization. There's just this idea that religion and some of these theological questions are things that we can just laugh off and just throw into the dustbin of history, rather than to quote, there's a guy, a pastor named Douglas Wilson, who basically says it's never whether but which, in terms of your theology, in terms of your theological presuppositions. Like we can't evade them. Like we're going to have theological presuppositions that manifest themselves in how we look at the world and how we think about it. The question is, who is the identity of our deity at the center of our system? And so this is kind of what I would be getting at in terms of, I would love to get the grounding for your critique. So my question is this: are governments fit to have the type of conversations that to be able to control the economy? Or do you just look at this like, hey, this is just, it's going to happen, and so we have to make the best of it? Because like I look at this and I'm like, if a government tried to force a tax on oxygen, like it's theoretically possible that a government could be so hubristic that they could try to do something like that. But you'd get to the question very quickly of the authority. Like, by what authority do you have to try to control and tax this kind of thing? I honestly think like a government could try this today and actually get away with it to a degree, because the average person is so out of touch with the basic questions of governance, of like, what is government for? Like, what are the limits? Is it just a matter of getting a law passed to define limit? Like, what are our laws just the result of, is it just positivism, or is there some sort of natural law? Like, I think the average person cannot answer those questions whatsoever. So would kind of love to hear your thoughts on some of those things.
Well, the first thing about just to get back to I know we're starting at a very basic level here, but the statistical, the probabilistic thing. So what you just said, that everybody wants to base things based on science, and they ignore things like history, or you might say law. I think law is a really nice example a lot of the time. That's kind of what you're talking about with criminal investigations. They're ultimately presented before a court of law. Just two quick things on that. First of all, Keynes's book on probability, I'd really encourage people to read it. It's about treating probability about the probability of statements, not about the probability of facts, about the probability of statements. And that's really interesting to me, because that is what a judge does. They treat the probability of statements. That's what a historian does. They treat the probability of statements, especially the longer you go back in history, the more you have to look into the probability of statements. I think this is a really compelling question. I think it's one of the most compelling questions for for people in a sense. You can even go so far as to say every time that you do a repeatable controlled experiment, you're ultimately dealing in some sense with a statement. Okay, maybe it's a little bit far, but barring that, I think you're basically dealing with statements. The second thing is even the more scientific or scientistic version of probability theory. So the most popular today is called Bayesian theory, right? And I wrote an essay maybe a year and a half ago for Post-Liberal Order, and I pointed out that I don't think anyone knows this. Bayesian theory was come up with by a guy, a British clergyman, an Anglican clergyman called Thomas Bayes, right? But not just that. This isn't just the the priests can do science too. No. He came up with it to prove Christian miracles against David Hume.
Let's go.
He thinks the Bayesian formula, so if anyone works in any sort of scientific field, they'll have used the Bayesian formula before. The Bayesian formula is created by Thomas Bayes and then published by Richard Price, who was his student or his mentor or whatever. And it was to prove that the Humean critique of miracles, i.e. that miracles can't happen within the scientific framework, falls. People should go back and look at those Richard Price papers. It's nuts to me that the whole thing's being turned on its head.
Yep.
It's completely strange. But that's just a point that these theories aren't what they're deployed for anymore. And it's very, very odd to me. I think the original people looking at aspects of probability, which forms into all of these inferential sciences and economics and theories of government and all that, they would be aware of the discussion that we're having now. And it's the people who have taken their ideas in a reified form, you might say, in the equation form, that have jettisoned all the presuppositions of what these theories were all about. So in terms of the issue then of government and so on, this is where the post-Keynesians and the Austrians depart, and it's a very interesting point of departure, because the Austrians tend to say what you've just said, that since we have this limited amount of knowledge, this uncertainty of the future, call it whatever you will, so some sort of limits on human knowledge. They say, well, you're best leaving decision-making decentralized. Because if you centralize decision-making, you'll always make mistakes.
Yep.
It's effectively the TLDR version of it.
Yep.
The post-Keynesians push the uncertainty argument further. And they say, no, you don't get it. The uncertainty aspect, the lack of knowledge and foresight and all, actually means that disaggregated or decentralized decision-making will lead to unstable outcomes, chaotic outcomes. And that actually what this means is you need collective decision-making, you need collective consensus decision-making. Sure. Now, there's no hard and fast principles for what that is. You could be a more limited government post-Keynesian, you could be a socialist. I mean, some of them are socialists. Yep. So there's no hard and fast rules on that. Some of them don't think markets work at all, basically. Yeah. I think markets mostly work. Yeah. They're pretty okay. They're an okay way of distributing resources. I don't think they're very good for allocating capital all the time. Yeah. But so there's two readings on the uncertainty thing. One reading is don't tread on me reading, which is governments can never have enough information to solve a problem. The other is a more radical one. People don't have enough information, and they actually need to make collective decisions for that reason. I'd say, not to be snarky, but I'd say human history is on the side of the latter interpretation. Societies do tend to be organized. They do tend to lay down laws, and they do tend to create shared consensus about ethical principles and so on. And this would tend to suggest that the natural state or natural law or whatever you want to call it is a consensus formation. I don't think any of this says anything hard and fast to say about, for example, whether Jerome Powell's a good central banker. I think you can have reasonable opinions on that either way. But I'm just pointing out that the epistemological aspect common to these two traditions actually can lead in two different directions.
Yeah. Yeah. And this, I mean, I look at, I go back to, I mean, you look at, again, at least if the stories can be believed about like the formation of central banking, the formation of the Federal Reserve, like some of these things. And there's all kinds of, details of this, the shady, the smoky room on Jekyll Island, all this kind of stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, you have like a partnership between private entities and government officials that is done to, I mean, arguably to basically ward off competition from wildcat banking. So like there's some of this where I'm just like, I look at this and I'm like, I look at this from the standpoint of somebody who's a philosophy major and then worked in ministry as a missionary and pastor. And I'm like, oh, look, the love of money is still a root of all kinds of evil. Like I just look at like the power, the drive for more power and more money. Like this seems like a pretty good, it seems like a pretty good way to explain the rise of central banking. Obviously, it's couched in all kinds of things that end up being false and ridiculous, like we mentioned. Like this is going to do away with the boom bust cycle, and really it causes more. And so it's like, all right, well, if a system is what it does, then like maybe the actual point of this was not to actually serve people. Maybe it was just to serve this limited interest, both in a governmental and private banking. From that standpoint, it's like that seems like a much better explanation. And then just looking at this, it just, I look at this and I look at the last 100 years that we've had this system, 112, whatever it is, and I don't think that we're. I mean, you can say, are we better off? Like, I mean, it's like, by what metric are we doing this? Are we talking about like are we evaluating this on a moral level? Or like, but even then there's all kinds of questions. So I don't know. It's just not as clear to me. Like I understand the project and I understand like the desire for mankind to exercise control. And obviously I would look at it from a biblical standpoint, and we go to like Genesis 3 or Genesis 1 and 2, and God basically tells mankind to exercise dominion. And so like there's clearly, like the question is, what does that look like? And so I think that there's been people who would align themselves with a more Keynesian idea of the world, and they would say, hey, look, we're just trying to be good dominionists. We're trying to, basically harness the world and channel it for good, which again, in the abstract, I would agree with. I think this is a good thing. I think it just comes down to, where do we draw these lines? That would be a question. And then beyond that, I think the thing that I'd want to go back to, and I think that you'd agree with me on, is just like, this is at bottom, this is the theological question. Like, we can't just keep continuing this fiction that these are not deeply theological questions, because I mean, at the end of the day, this is what they are. Like, we're talking about, what does it mean to be human? We're talking about where does authority come from? What are the limits on governmental authority? And so I think like we've been able to kind of, in the name of, for the last 100 years, or like at least 75 years, in the name of like economic expediency, we've been able to not talk about philosophy at the highest levels of policy and politics. And I think, and in the end, maybe this will be a good bridge over to the collapse of global liberalism. Like, I think that's part of the collapse, is we've reached the end of just being able to kind of push these conversations to the background. Like they're coming back with a vengeance. So I would love to kind of get your thoughts on that as well. Like what are your thoughts there? And then maybe we can move into the new book.
I think what we're seeing today, especially, is that increased technocracy does not lead to better outcomes in anything at all. I mean, there was a kind of a golden period of technocracy in America, at least between the 1930s, New Deal, and I'd say maybe the 1960s. And I don't mean into the 1960s. I think the fascination with technocracy was up until about 1960, 1965, at which point libertine ideas start to take over, and it becomes a completely different thing. But between the 50s and the 30s, 40s obviously with the war, but the 30s and the 50s were these periods where there was a lot of optimism about managing society through technocracy in the United States. And I think basically this is the foundation of the contemporary United States government. I'm definitely a adherent to this idea that there hasn't been one republic in the United States. There's been at least four and perhaps five, and I think one of them was put in place by FDR in the New Deal. And that came to an end. Chris Caldwell says with the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. I think that's probably true. I think that's accurate.
Can you name the five? What did you say? The five? What was the word you used?
Republics. So the idea behind this theory of America is that people will know that France is currently on its fourth republic, I think. So there's actually, anytime they have a constitutional change, like there's a fundamental change in their way of government, they announce it and they say we have a new republic.
Sure.
And it's not a criticism, but one reading of American history is that they've actually been through a couple of republics. And they haven't named it, and they've pretended that they have constitutional continuity. The British did the same thing with the Glorious Revolution and the beheading of Charles and so on. Britain has a bunch of revolutions in its history, and it claims to have none. And it's a strange thing. So can I name all the American? I mean, now I feel like I'm being put on the spot now. American Revolution, Civil War, FDR. The controversial one is civil rights, and I'm missing one there. Maybe it's Jackson. I think it's Jackson.
Okay.
So basically, that these are fundamentally different systems, and the one that existed between the New Deal period, the hard New Deal period, 1930s until the 1960s, was one of technocracy, and it's the one in which what they call the blob or the bureaucracy or the the swamp or whatever you want to call it in DC, the permanent government grew up. That was when that grew up, and some of the goals of that were changed in the post-civil rights era. There's no doubt about that. But the fundamental structure of it is from the FDR period. And basically that the idea there was that you could technocratically manage a society. And I think what we're getting at as global liberalism and liberalism itself starts to collapse is that well, first of all, we've known for a while that probably doesn't work. But beyond the fact it just doesn't work, it's not even that these are particularly important aspects. The neglect of what I'd call natural law principles, but you could talk about, broad ethical principles, social norms, so on. Like, these are clearly, or at least I think, these are clearly more important for the functional running of a society than any sort of clever whiz-bang technocratic management. I mean, I have a very keen sense of this because I grew up in Ireland, and I grew up in Ireland at an amazingly interesting time. When I was 8 years old, divorce was still illegal in Ireland. In 1995, it was still illegal to divorce somebody. I make no comment. It was illegal to do. I remember it. I remember when people couldn't get divorced. I literally remember, because even for a couple of years after it was made legal, it was super controversial. And basically, Ireland would not have aspired to being anything resembling technocracy or anything like that. And now it's become a modern technocratic state where if you go into government, you talk like, a civil servant, bureaucrat, interest rates, all this gobbledygook. And has Ireland become more or less stable? 100% less stable. I mean, 100% less stable. The country is not what it was. It's a very kind of strange, murky, people don't really know what they want, they don't know what they believe, the birth rates are collapsing, migration's gone absolutely nuts, people hate it, there's political instability, the authorities are afraid of, the usual stuff, the stuff that's all over the West right now. And I just look at that and I go, and just comparing that to like this society that didn't really care about any of those issues and just kind of focused on like how to live your life, like you should have a family and like you should behave in this way and blah blah blah. And it's shocking. And as well, another thing, like the murder rate went through the roof in Ireland after this. The suicide rate went through the roof. I published a paper on this on the Dan Institute, if anyone, a statistical overview of how Ireland improved after it adopted basically liberalism. It deteriorated on every metric except GDP. GDP was the only thing that it improved on. Apart from GDP, everything declined. Political stability, suicide, murder, drug addiction, alcoholism, everything went up. So it seems that this focus on like technocracy and a lack of focus on what people have been focusing on since, Adam, basically, seems to lead to social collapse. It's kind of funny. It's kind of weird.
And so I look at that and I'm like, is this feature or bug? Like, because like I look at it, you look at like if the goal, I mean, you could look at the breakdown of the household, right? When they, the women's liberation movement, where like women are out in the workplace, so our GDP goes up, but our families collapse. Like, so the outcomes of people is much worse off. And so like it's like when if you're defining success by these economic measurables, then and not in these intangible, like if you're, I guess I would say it this way, if your denominator for success is dollars, then you're going to take a very different course of action than if your denominator for success is people. and so like this is where, I mean, I look at, you mentioned like the shift to technocracy. You said like 30s to the 50s. And so it's like, I look at this and I'm like, none of that's even possible. Like the only reason why that change was even possible to the same degree is once you introduce like state created money. Like, right? Like, because state created money that's effectively just arbitrarily created, like you can have unlimited quantity of it. Like that gives governments so much more control over so much more of society through just, I mean, you don't get what you want, you get what you subsidize. So we have all kinds of things that have been subsidized. And again, there's a limit to what you can do, but like it is, I mean, I mean, you could look at like the LBGT, like that movement and its ability to, the way that it's spread across the world, like trans ideology, like a lot of this stuff is not stuff that's being demanded by markets. It's stuff that's being subsidized by nonprofit organizations who are getting money from the government. And so like there is like this partnership there that like, I mean, again, at the risk of oversimplicity, like they're in the Bitcoin world, there's people who say, if you fix the money, you fix the world. Obviously that's an oversimplification, but it's not as far of an oversimplification as a lot of people would think, just because of the nature of incentives and the nature of the way that money, works in society. So I don't know, like I would love to kind of hear your thoughts on that.
I think people are too obsessed with money and making money. I think economic growth itself, this metric of economic growth, has gone gangbusters. You just gave an example, right? I read an article about this called "The Overlooked Contradiction of Capitalism" for American Affairs about 2 years ago or something. And I pointed out that to maximize GDP growth, you have to maximize production and consumption, right? So you have to go to work as much as possible and you have to consume as much as possible. So what type of person is that? That's not someone with a family. That's not someone with a family. But here's the problem. GDP growth rests on two things: labor force growth and productivity growth, right? Yeah. Abstract productivity growth, that's difficult. We don't know really what to do with that. We don't even really know what it is. It's just a statistic. We know what labor force growth is. It's people. So the short-term incentives of capitalism to make you, and any system that tries to maximize GDP growth, which could be communist as well, make you go to work, make you consume as much as possible. But then the next generational cycle, GDP will decline because there won't be as many people. And you'll have all these problems in your economy. This will be a very post-Keynesian uncertainty critique, which you say, well, there you go. There's a decentralized system, but we all agree to maximize, capital output or GDP or, transactions. GDP is just transactions. It's just passing money from one hand to another. We agree to maximize that, and look at this, you generate all these contradictions in terms of your long-term planning. So I think we just shouldn't be, I don't know why we're so obsessed. Look, obsessing about GDP is bad for society as far as I can tell, but it doesn't actually get the GDP to go up either. The GDP is stagnant at the moment. It's just the wrong measure. We're just chasing the wrong things. And this complete obsession with production and consumption is crazy to me. I'll give you one example, right? So in Hungary right now, the government here gets a lot of flack because it subsidizes churches and pubs in small Hungarian villages, right? And people say this is the most wasteful money you could have. So some people just say it's a waste. And some people say it creates economic inefficiencies or whatever. So they're giving money to restore little churches in small little villages in Hungary. And they're also putting money effectively behind the bar and a pub because these pubs can't stay open. They're not competitive. And what you realize if you go to one of these villages is that the pub and the church are the center of the entire life of the town. And I'm just like, as people, a lot of American conservatives go, you can't do that. That you're propping up an inefficient business. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Inefficient business? And, and by the way, and then I have to point out to them that the birth rates in these villages are substantially higher than in the cities.
Yeah.
And I said, well,
Imagine
there's
that.
a natalist element to this as well. But
Yes.
it just shows like we've kind of missed the boat on this whole of what we're judging metrics by. Like, I think if your homicide rate is going up, that's probably one of the worst. This homicide and suicide rates
Yeah.
are two of the worst statistics you can see deteriorate, to my mind.
Hmm.
Drug addiction's pretty bad too. And back in the day, people would have known this. Like Durkheim wrote a book on suicide. He said if suicide's going up, you've got a society that's kind of falling apart. You could say something similar about homicide rates, and we've just lost sight of this. Like, you hear every single quarter about what GDP growth is,
Yeah.
but like it's only kind of people who are interested that know where the suicide rate went or the homicide rate went.
Yeah.
Like, why is that?
Yeah. Yeah, you've got that, and then I mean, you look at, again, just to further describe the problem. I mean, you've got people who are excited with the stock market price going up, when in reality, like if you just look at like you look at like the growth, like so much of it is just the new money. Like it's just a way to keep track of how much money has entered the system. Like there's the, broadly speaking, the growth actually isn't there anymore, to the point that we're being like the US economy is being propped up by like insanely valued AI companies. Like if not for these AI companies, the market's in shambles. And so I look at this and I'm like, and a lot of us look at this in the Bitcoin world and we're like, this is just like your denominator is broken. And so like it doesn't matter. Like these are, I would be in favor. I think the policy of favor of giving money to these towns, like insofar as there's a quote unquote good thing to give money to, like, yeah, I'll take that over, these other things any day of the week. But it's still, it's like, if you look for the longer time horizon, it's like, you're not going to be able to outpace a broken denominator. So the question is like, how do you fix the monetary denominator? That's the metric by which people are doing business. How do you outpace if that is just losing value perpetually? And like, I don't see a way that you can do it. The only thing I can see is like, you need something that's going to you need a currency unit that's going to get more valuable over time. Like and then like that will, and so you could look at home prices. Like, this is another thing. Like you look at home prices, and the way that I have described this is, it's like a family where if the father abandons the family, then somebody else is going to have to fill the vacuum that he was supposed to fill. And so if it's the mother, then she's going to suffer because she's trying to do two people's jobs. If it's a grandparent, they're going to suffer because they can't just be a grandparent. If it's going to be aunt and uncle, whatever it is. And so similarly, like the function of money in society, like if you stop having a scarce money, then something else is going to have to take on these monetary properties. And the problem was so one of the things that's happened in the world is that real estate has taken on much more of these properties. And the problem is that real estate makes poor money for a number of metrics. And then it also just increases the price of real estate over time to create some of these problems where younger people aren't able to afford real estate. So like, I don't see any way the big problems get fixed without a return to money being money, to allow all these other things, including real estate, including some of these other things, like to be what they are, and not ask them to be what they are and also be money, if that were monetary units.
Deeper, the addiction to what I call the Wall Street model, or the rentier model, in America, is because of fundamental structural changes to the economy that have taken place. I mean, they're a long time, but I mean, back to the 80s at least. Yeah. And this is offshoring manufacturing and propping the whole thing up with King Dollar. Like that's what created this. And then it formed a massive lobby around Wall Street. Pinnacle of that was Greenspan, Timothy Geithner, Larry Summers, these guys in the Clinton era. But there were holdovers as well into the Bush era and so on. And then it fell apart in 2008, and everyone's been confused about what to do since, basically. But the Wall Street model, that's what it was. And as the Wall Street model deteriorates, it used to just be, chasing .coms, pets.coms, all this kind of stuff up the ladder or whatever, and people could say it's kind of harmless. And now the excess capital, the excess cash is just flowing into everything. Housing markets, as you said, I don't believe the YIMBY stuff. It's credit driven. I can show that in multiple different markets. It's credit driven. But it's not even credit driven at this stage. It's being driven by quote unquote shadow banks, private equity funds and hedge funds. And these are taking money out of the pension funds. And by the way, the whole thing's going to blow up, and it's going to be an absolute nightmare. And people are going to worry where their pension went. And then we're going to have to bail out the pensions. We could talk about that. That is 100%. Going to be an enormous scandal. It's going to make 2008 look like a complete joke, because 2008 was confined to the banks. This stuff is being lent out of the pension funds, and no one will admit it. It's absolutely shocking what's going on. But the point is that everybody, like, what happened to America and to the West more broadly, but mainly to America and the United Kingdom, and Ireland's been touched by this as well, because it's kind of in the same bracket, and actually Australia too, and Canada. So it's really the Anglosphere this has happened to. And what's happened is that America became deindustrialized, not as bad as Britain, but it had a substantial amount of deindustrialization. And what we did was we some of these kind of more libertarian policies that were pursued from the Reagan era up until whenever, today, I guess, the Trump administration's still doing them, they're not actually opening up, like, making it easier for small shops or something to open up in towns, which I'm in favor of. Fine, I don't want too much regulations or taxes on small businesses, like, obviously. But that's not really what's happened. What's happened is that they've deregulated all these sectors where this, like, parasite capital goes in. I mean, I saw recently, it's one of my favorite current examples, that the price of RV parks, of campgrounds, has gone through the roof. Now, some of this is due to an increase of use after the pandemic, but not all of it. The private equity industry is buying up all these campgrounds. And it's destroying. This is not, even like standard economics 101 does not say that when a big private equity fund comes in with the wealth of 5% of the nation's pension funds or something behind it, and starts scooping up all these campgrounds and merging them into some big oligarchy or monopoly or something, and jacking the prices and making the services suck. And like that is not what is meant by like market competition or whatever. But we don't even know how to deal with it. The entire late liberal capitalist system seems to be turning into this giant like rentier grift. And like everything's a grift, and everything's like, how do I utilize money capital to like corner a market, or to extract more rent out of somebody, or to get someone addicted to a gambling app or a dating app or whatever, and maybe it's destroying their lives. I don't care, because I'm just extracting the rent. But the point is, and here's where I diverge from you, I think that's a much deeper problem than just the problem of credit creation and money. I think that you could do that with Bitcoin. You could do that on a gold standard system. This is a serious problem with the way that we're structuring our societies. And I don't really have a hard and fast rule about it. Where I would start is looking at the worst aspects of this. And I think currently America's about to have an enormous explosion of gambling problems because of these gambling apps that are incredibly addictive. 100%. And actually realize, like, we had gambling laws in place for a reason. And with these addictive apps, like 10 times we need them. Same with, like, I don't know, that's easy enough with like Vice products, and I think that's where we should start. But when you get, I don't have a hard and fast answer for like, how do you prevent private equity buying up all the campgrounds and buying up all these family homes in Texas. I don't have a hard and fast rule for that, but we need to be more nuanced. And I think this is where I diverge from the money reform people, that I don't think money reform is going to get you there. And I think that a lot of these guys who are making money out of this are perfectly happy for people to be focused on monetary reform and not talking about, for example, like the gambling app that's like ruining 1 in 5 people's lives or something like that.
And let me clarify, like I don't think Bitcoin in itself is going to do it, because I'm 100% with you. The analogies that I've used, like the examples that I think are relevant are, you've got Luther, right? Like Luther, he's pointing out problems with the church, he's pointing out hypocrisy, he's pointing out grift, all this kind of stuff. And obviously there was, again, there's other interests in there. There were people interested in funding his dissenting opinions. So that's definitely the case as well. But so that was going on, but he was aided, okay, his more or less righteous cause, okay, we can debate, he never wanted to leave the Catholic Church, but like his righteous critiques were enabled and furthered because of this technological innovation in the printing press, right? Like this enabled him to expand his, spread them farther wide, other countries, which caught on there and helped produce what it produced. Another example of this that doesn't have the technological aspect is Wilberforce, right? Like Wilberforce, he's making moral critiques. He's trying to awaken the moral consciences of this more or less Christian nation to alert them to basically, hey, yes, you are personally enriching yourselves. Your nation is being personally enriched on the back of injustice, of slavery. And so he actually was able to, by virtue of making religious arguments, was able to, basically help the British people end up taking steps that would be arguably against their economic interest, by ending the slave trade. So that happens. And so that's more like those two situations are more akin to where I see, like, I don't think Bitcoin, I think like there are moral arguments that need to be made, and that we need like Christians on whatever level that they find themselves in to begin having these conversations and critiquing, not just on pragmatic basis, but on a moral grounds and on, again, just loving your neighbor grounds. And so again, it's going to be complicated because of this whole discourse of separation of church and state and all this kind of stuff. Like for a lot of people, they've just been one-shotted by this whole idea of the separation of church and state, and they can't even fathom what this would look like and the legitimacy of having things like vice laws, like who's vice by whose standard. Like it's going to be a complicated thing. At the same time, I do agree with you that things have gotten so bad, and I think are going to continue to get worse, that we are kind of rediscovering why vice laws exist. We are kind of like rediscovering why some of the indecency laws exist. When you look at things like issues like pornography and the pornification of everything, and the just the way that that has transformed society for the worse, and the outcomes of that. I think it's been easy. The story's been easy to drink down. Oh, this was just the fuddy-duddies. These are just these people who just wanted to control everything. That's why these laws existed. And I think we're going to discover through a lot of pain that no, actually there was something far more real grounding all these things. So yeah, want to clarify. I 100% agree with you. Bitcoin is not this panacea that's going to fix everything, but I do think that like a return to scarce money is one tool, one part that does have extended consequences, but it's not a substitute for, again, this is a people problem. Like this is if our denominator if our functional denominator that God would call us to use, and that is going to produce the best outcomes, is doing what is in the best interest of the people of a nation, then yes, it's going to revolve. It's not just going to be simple. We just fixed a couple levers and then we can fix this thing. Like it's going to require people to be courageous, and people to step up and do what people have done to further human flourishing for thousands of years.
Look, you're always going to have regulations, pretty strong ones on economic relations. I'll give you one example, right? Contract killing.
Yes.
Contract killing is a market transaction.
Exactly.
But we're like, okay, well, you can't contract kill people. Like that's illegal. Okay, so like start there. Human trafficking, illegal.
Yeah.
Okay, what's happened now? What's happened now? This is actually what's happening as global liberalism collapses, is that these really disgusting money-making activities that have gone on probably since the beginning of time, but were vastly expanded when modern economies, trade economies, and monetary economies grew up in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. These really repulsive things were then. They were outside. They were projected onto the rest of the world. I mean, one of the most dramatic is the Opium Wars. Just look into the Opium Wars. It's crazy. Like these guys getting the entire of China addicted to opium, and then like when they refused to buy the opium because it was destroying their society, they went to war with them. With like private navy like it's nuts stuff.
Crazy.
We did that over there, and people like Wilberforce or whatever said this is not right. Now what's happened is those practices have come back to the mainland.
Yeah.
Like that's what's happening. You
Yeah.
look at like the opioid crisis and trace it back to the Sackler family. Like
Wow.
that's an opium war thing. And
Yeah.
okay, they didn't use gunboats. They used lobbying in DC. That's what
Yeah.
they did.
Yeah.
And like we all know what happened there now.
Yeah.
So this is happening at like multiple levels. If I don't think making money in and of itself is illegal or immoral, but I think there's a lot of immoral ways to make money, like a
100%.
lot, and
Yeah.
they're very, very tempting because there's only a certain amount of moral ways to make money, and there
Correct.
probably isn't. There probably isn't enough to go around, if you see what I mean. So,
Yes.
like,
Yep.
only and if everyone's acting morally, less people are going to make fortunes. But if
Yeah.
everyone's allowed to act immorally, more people are going to make fortunes. Not
It, this,
everybody, but more
yes.
people.
This is 100% the case. This is why, again, I can't prove this, but one of the thoughts that I've had since thinking more about economics, I read the story in the scriptures of the disciples being mystified that the rich, like it'd be hard for the rich to inherit the kingdom. And like if you think about it in like a scarce money context, the only way to get rich, well, the only legitimate way to get rich is to serve the needs and interests of a lot of people. And so like if you're thinking about this, like if you're operating with this mindset that the way that you get rich is by loving and serving your neighbor, then somebody who's rich has served and loved lots of people. And so then it would make sense that you'd be confused about how somebody who served and loved lots of people would find it difficult to get into the kingdom. And so it seems that Jesus has a much more real understanding of the nature of capital, capital creation and capital accumulation. And so yeah, I do think this is a huge issue. It's going to blow people's minds when like a healthier society looks like GDP going down for at least a period of time. But I think you're absolutely right that like that's what's needed. It's going to need to happen. And again,
well, my recent American Affairs article is saying that we should measure the GDP differently, and we should actually exclude these activities. Just really quickly on the biblical view of making money. A lot of it has to do with the time period.
Yeah.
If you're living in the time of the New Testament, okay, who has money? Well, the king has money. Okay, the government has money. Yes, because they can levy taxes. But and some merchants, legitimate merchants who are doing trade across the Middle East, or what we call the Middle East now. How do most people make money if they aren't rich and they want to get rich? Debt or tax collection. Like those were basically for 95 or 98% of people. If you really wanted to get rich in that time period, those were your two. Those were your two options. And of course, as everybody I hope know, tax collection back then was not the IRS, whatever you think of the IRS, but it was not even the IRS. It was mafia stuff.
Yeah.
It was shakedown artistry.
Yep.
It was you'd break people's knuckles and stuff, and awful business. And loaning money was not going down to the local bank and taking out a mortgage to buy a house for your white picket fence wife and 3 kids. No, it was human slavery. That's what it was.
Exactly.
For the most part, money lending back then ended up in human slavery of some sort.
Yeah.
So that's why that view was taken in the Bible. Now, when during the Reformation period, and especially if you read the very interesting counter reformers, the Salamanca school, who are the first real, in my opinion, modern economists, what they realize is that some of the older laws that were put in place in the medieval period were not really working as mercantile trade developed in Europe. And they said, okay, what worked, basically they wouldn't have had this language, but what worked, what the rules were under feudalism made sense under feudalism. And now, as mercantile capital's developing, we have to have a more nuanced view on, for example, money lending, because we need lines of commercial credit for mercantile vessels and so on.
Yeah.
And they were fine with that. That kind of sorted itself out. But the overcorrection there is there shouldn't be any rules. No. And now what we're getting out of, I would say, 40 years of free market rhetoric, which is not going to small businesses competing with you. We have more monopoly after this. We have more awful stuff. But what we're seeing is we're going back to that kind of New Testament era. Because so much is already done, because there's so many shops, because there's so many pet clinics, because you have all the services you need at your fingertips. This is kind of what my essay's about, the last one for American Affairs, on what I call consumption deepening. Because you have all these things at your fingertips, the only places to make money anymore, if you're an upstart, I'm not saying the only, but a lot of the only places, are vice stuff.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing. I saw, just to give an example, in Britain's really falling apart. We could spend a whole hour talking about it. It's an emergency. It's so bad what's happening.
We'll have you come back and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, maybe. It's so depressing. And people in Britain, I lived there for most of my life, and people in Britain complain to me because they think I'm bashing the country. I'm not, guys. Like, you just got to recognize this keep calm and carry on thing is not working anymore.
Yeah.
The country's falling apart. But they had the Financial Times, which is the equivalent of the Wall Street Journal in Europe, is usually has this very high prestige thing, which is lunch with the FT, and lunch with the FT is for business leaders and blah blah blah, and they're the only fans CEO on. And I just said that's what's happening there. And what's happening is that the economy is collapsing in on itself in a way that's more dramatic than in America, but America's facing down some serious problems too. Britain's facing them down times 3 or 4. And it's coming up on them a lot quicker than it's happening in the United States. And what's happening is that the vultures are moving in. And that they're normalizing stuff. They're normalizing, like, here's a community leader, the CEO of OnlyFans. And you're like, are you crazy? Are you going to have the COO of human trafficking on, their human trafficking department on next week? Like, you guys don't, you let this stuff out and you will reap a whirlwind. Like, it will not work out like you're thinking. It's going to completely demolish your society, humiliate your people. You're going to be turned into like a joke. Really sad stuff's going to happen, and it's going to be very, very generationally hard to come back from that kind of decline. But as both we have saturation of consumption, so we have all our goods met, and then we have what I think is coming, a contraction in living standards in much of the West. The temptation is to open, Skid Row everywhere. And that, I think, is the most pressing problem right now. It really is, because we're not going to sort out this economic situation that we've got ourselves in. This is 30, 40 years of bad policy now. We're not going to sort it out overnight, but we need to contain some of the worst that's coming down the pipeline. And I think, as you say, we need to look back to this kind of like, we need to put some moral judgments on what business is allowed and what business isn't. And not just in vice stuff. Lending, credit cards, gambling. We need to start really thinking about this now.
And like, this is, I mean, the lending, we could bring it up. I mean, just the thing with lending just when I was reading your book, and I got to one point where it was talking about, I think like they have to have like at least 10% reserves. Like at the time of writing, like they had to have at least 10% reserves in the banks. And then like when COVID hit, it was 0% reserves. So now it's just like totally, just lending out just willy nilly. And so it's just like, this was totally predictable. Like this was always, it was 100, then it went down from there, went to 90. And then it just over time just whittles down. And again, the critique, the pushback from this town who's partnering with OnlyFans is, well, listen, if we don't take their money, then where's the money going to come from? And so again, it gets back, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here, but like at some point, like, there's multiple things that need to change. Like that's what I'm saying. And the money is one of them. You can't, like, whatever these other changes are, it can't be done separately from changing whatever the money is, because like that drives so many of the incentives. And so like, we look at this with so TGFB has been operating as a for-profit enterprise. And so we're a media company, we do podcasts, we do conferences and stuff like that. And so as we've had people reach out to us from these dubious crypto projects who want to give us lots of money in order to sponsor our conferences and this kind of stuff. And I tell them to kick rocks regularly because like, I'm not interested in them farming out and like prostituting my audience for the sake of their garbage crypto project. But there's plenty of people who are totally willing to do that and throw up their hands and do the free market thing and just basically say, hey, who am I to just not take their money? This project could be good at some point in the future. And it's just like you get these people who are desperate, and these businesses who prioritize their existence over over the good of their customers over the medium to long term, and like this really is the crisis that we're facing. And to put this in biblical parlance, it's like Christ calls us to die to ourselves, and there's a lot of people who are not comfortable with that level of death. Like they're not they're not content to do that, and so again, that's understandable to a degree, but also there comes a certain point where you have to have a North Star moral guiding system that is guiding you by something other than I need to make money. And so like until we get, and like these lines are already drawn. We already have these lines drawn. You mentioned contract killing, you mentioned prostitution, you mentioned some of these other things. We do draw these lines. They were drawn during an age an age where we knew a lot more of the reasons behind what we were doing. We're currently in like a point where we've kind of forgotten why of all these things, and we're kind of rediscovering them. But yeah, it really is one of these situations where I think things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. And again, some of the ways to cope with this, you mentioned like one way to cope is, all right, we're going to take money from OnlyFans. Another way to cope with the decisions that they made is just open immigration, where we're going to treat people like they're like people are a dime a dozen. One person is as good as another. It doesn't matter what their beliefs are. It doesn't matter what their religious convictions are. And there's just severe underestimation of the consequences of doing that. So the example that I always go back to is in some place like Dearborn, Michigan, where you've got humongous Muslim population. Are you familiar with Dearborn?
Yeah, I know Dearborn, Michigan. So I've never been there, but I know.
Yeah. I know. Me either, but humongous Muslim population. And so one of the interesting things is the consequences of having a large Muslim population. They start to their religion starts to affect the laws. And so this has been exposed in the in divorce policy. So in Islamic countries, largely overwhelmingly speaking, when there is a divorce, the children go with the man. And so this is coming into conflict with in the United States, at least at this point, where again, largely speaking, the children go with the mother. And so you have this crisis of law is based in a crisis of religion, and of like who is right, how do we make these decisions? And so when you're getting this importation of immigrants from whether it's Muslim countries or Southeast Asian countries, or it's not as excuse me. It's not as bad when you're importing people from South American countries where they do have this largely Christian conception of the world. There's much more similarities there than there is in some of the Eastern Asian context. But like these are real changes. These are real, real differences that produce humongously different outcomes and powerfully different outcomes that are creating much more conflict, that are going to create much more conflict as time goes on. And so it's not going to be as simple as, we just import new people and then we can pay them less, and then they're content paying less, being paid less, and then this is just going to work. It's literally a Band-Aid on the gaping hole of the Titanic. These things are not going to work, but they make sense if you're looking at from a political standpoint, who's just trying to, somebody who's just trying to stay in office or get elected maybe for another 4-year term. Like if we had a monarchy, for example, and this person was governing for life, these are not the decisions that these kind of people would be making. This whole political question is super interesting. And unfortunately, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better because people are still thinking over 5-minute time horizons.
It is going to get worse. And this is why I keep saying, like, a big hit to living standards and other things is probably coming by 2030 in most Western countries. And worse in some, less bad in others. But it's probably coming. And I'm only warning that making kind of more long-term plans about how to dig your way out of that, it's another question. I think about it. I think it's possible, but it's going to take a while to get done. But there's going to be a pretty nasty period here, and the only thing that I can say is that to totally destroy a society, you have to kind of destroy its dignity and its culture. And you may not be able to solve 30 or 40 years of bad economic policy or longer than that of kind of family policy or whatever you want to call what happened over the past, I don't know, 100 years or 50 years or whatever you want to call it. Those things are going to take a long time to solve. But what can be focused on right now from this kind of quasi economic perspective is what we're going to let in.
Mm,
Because you see, if you think about this for a minute, like, right, go back to like the 1950s or something, especially in Europe. Like the 1950s in Europe, a lot of countries are pretty poor. I mean,
yeah,
Ireland is it would definitely have been considered a developing country in the 1950s in Europe. Italy probably would have been as well, parts of France and so on. Maybe not Germany, might have been a little bit wealthier, England a little bit wealthier, but
yeah,
loads of these countries would have been considered what we consider developing countries. Now, um, most of them weren't tempted to like go down the kind of like complete crap hole, right?
yeah,
And turn into complete disaster, mess societies. Like I'm thinking my model's always kind of Russia in the 1990s, like
yeah,
really falling apart. Like it's horrendous what happened there for the period of about 10 or 15 years. And you know these countries didn't naturally go there. Now their living standards are going to be substantially lower than anything that happens in the West in the next 5 years or something
yeah,
like that. Now it's difficult to compare apples to apples
yeah,
in that regard because if you're priced out of the home market, for example, which many people are,
yeah,
you know, back then you might not have been priced out of the home market even if it was a HUD or something like that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
so it's difficult to do apples to apples, but ultimately will be wealthier than the Irish person in 1955 living in a thatched hut, right, and
yeah,
working really hard on the farm all day in the rain. But the problem is that it's the decline, it's the beta or the delta, as they say. It's the decline in living standards that tempts people to try and prop up their living standards
yeah,
doing stuff that they shouldn't do and that will really destroy not only their lives but it'll destroy the society around them,
yeah,
and it will do so in such a way that it will take generations for that society to recover.
yeah,
And I think that really should be the most immediate focus right now. We're seeing a lot of these kind of creepy crawlies coming out from under the fridge and we're going like, oh, that's kind of gross, what's that? And then we're
yeah,
kind of like, you know, we're always doing weird stuff. No, no, no. I think it's
yeah,
getting to the point now where like we have to be like, okay, I think there's a bug infestation problem,
yeah,
and maybe we should just like really focus on making sure that okay, we may not be able to solve all our problems in the economy and everything in the short term. Let's just ensure that we don't go down the
yeah,
social collapse route.
yeah,
That's my fear at the moment.
yeah.
The decline in living standards is going to drive people to do things that lead to broader kind of social degradation and potential collapse, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, I mean, this is what you see, these like niche beliefs. Like you have people who are acting like the fact that we don't have universal daycare or something like this is like this is the outrage of the hour. Like, we need no universal
Mm.
daycare. This is a human right. You know, daycare is a human right. And you just get all these kind of beliefs. You're just like, you have like, this makes no sense. This is like the fact that you have this standard when there's so many people around the world that, you know, who are in 100 times worse. And when you look at what is the trajectory that we're on, like these are just laughable. Like these concerns, I just think the average person has no idea just what's coming, and are totally delusional, totally in denial because they're believing what politicians are telling them. And I just think it's going to be bad. I would love to know. So you mentioned you live in Hungary, you live in Budapest. What kind of drove your decision to move to Budapest? Is some of these dynamics was that a play, or did you, find employment there? What was a combination of the two?
Yeah, I really do believe the West is about to collapse.
Yeah,
I'm not kidding. It's not a joke for me. I'm not
yeah.
selling anything.
You're
Well,
putting
my
your
book,
money
I
where your
guess,
mouth
but
is. Yeah, your body.
I put my money where my mouth is. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm trying to sell my book, but I wouldn't move to a substantially different part of the world with a very obscure language just to get talking points to sell my book.
Yeah,
No, I think something pretty bad's coming to Western Europe. And I think probably, well, definitely the UK is halfway through it, and I think
yeah,
America is going to be affected in different ways, but
yeah,
I have some concerns there. And I mean, this is the most stable country in Europe. It didn't have it didn't have any migration waves. It didn't happen here.
yeah,
It looks the same as it did pre whatever 2015. The economy, I mean, it's not doing great, but it's relatively stable.
yeah,
Society's very normal. It's a very
yeah,
normal place to live. It reminds me of Ireland when I was a kid. It's just a totally normal place.
yeah.
Most people don't think about all the strange stuff people else to think about, to be honest.
Yeah.
And there's good leadership. I mean, I don't care what people say about Orban. I think Viktor
Yeah.
Orban's the politician of the generation in Europe.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I just think it's a better place to live. I mean, I'm a European. I don't mind living in America either. But it's kind of a European place anyway.
Yeah.
In some sense, I know America. Don't take it the wrong way.
No, I take it. Listen,
but you know what I mean. It's
I'm
like
with you.
it's Europeanized culture. Okay.
Yes.
So like, but you know, I'm a European. I don't really want to live in Vietnam or whatever. I'm sure it's a nice place, but I don't have any desire to do that. And so basically, my talking point is Hungary's the furthest I can go to the east while staying in the west, in a sense.
Oh wow. Okay.
It really is Europe, by the way. People don't get this, and actually, probably I suffered from this too. My conception of Hungary maybe 10 years ago was probably that it was one of these Eastern European countries, which there's nothing wrong with the Eastern European countries, don't get me wrong, but they tend to be quite sterile because either they're kind of, I don't want to say fake countries, but either they were created quite recently, let's just say, or they were bombed to bits in World War II. And so they tend to be, like the communism hit them really hard. They have the tower blocks everywhere. Hungary's part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy.
Yeah.
And Budapest, I'm pretty sure, is like
culture.
the most beautiful city in Europe outside of maybe Rome.
Yep.
So like, it's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good deal here. Living standards are pretty good. I think the stats are fake, actually. I think the PPP adjusted GDP per capita stats are basically fake. I think the living standards are. We have loads of Americans over here.
Yep.
I wouldn't say loads, but there's American conservative types are living here.
Rod Dreher famously
circulating in and out of DC. Actually, 2 of them have gone recently back to DC. So there's a big circulation and stuff like that. But I think countries like Hungary are probably best placed in the broader West, let's call it. To weather what is coming, frankly.
Yeah.
I know that sounds really doomish, but
no, listen, I'm with you. So in terms of like just a couple questions about Hungary, like are they mostly self-sustaining? Like is there, I mean, are they producing a lot of their own stuff, or is there, vast import export stuff? Like what does that look like? Because I know that like the EU has exercised control over some of the things that they're able to, like other countries are able to do, and some of the the economies, the economic policy. So what does that look like, at least in your experience in Hungary?
Hungary are the only country in Europe I'm aware of that has consciously done self-sustaining in the basics, right? So the kind of potential crisis management. Now, I don't think things are going to get that bad. I'm a mid-level doom guy. I just think living standards are going to go down. Politics is going to become really unstable, stuff like that. I don't think we're going to be like eating out of bins or anything like that. But it's good to have your own stuff for sure. And Hungary, I think, is the only country in Europe that's done that. So it aims for self-sufficiency in food and energy and so on. And I think it's been very successful given the hand that it's been given. In terms of the broader economy, it's quite dependent because it's the main it's a big manufacturing economy, which is nice. It's not a kind of fake money economy. But a lot of it is automotives tied to the German automotive industry, which is in major decline because the Nord Stream pipeline, which was done by drunk sailors. I can't remember. There was something about that. Drunk sailors or something blew up our energy supply in Europe. I don't know. I can't remember. But anyway, the drunk sailors, man, I'm telling you. We need vice laws, you see, otherwise the sailors get drunk and they blow up energy pipelines. But anyway, so the...
Does it stop lying politicians? No, I don't think so. Okay, yeah.
No, it was drunk sailors. Poles or something, I think, Ukrainians, I can't remember. Anyway, so maybe it was the Finnish, I don't know. So anyway, all jokes aside, so the economy is not completely insulated. The manufacturing jobs and so on are definitely impacted by Europe, but most European countries are just kind of like on autopilot, and they're just trusting the plan, and there is no plan, so they're just trusting a non-existing plan. And Hungary is thinking very hard, like, how do we make the best of this situation? And the leadership here is, I mean, I know a lot of them. They're very impressive people. It's a bit of a philosopher king state.
That's
the average person. They portray these guys like, I read the European press sometimes, and you think like Fidesz are full of these like football hooligans. I know that there's a different term in America, but like football hooligans here, which is like soccer
Yeah.
hooligans that like go and start fighting. That's how they kind of portray them. But like actually the average party in Fidesz, Orban's party, the average like party member at a senior level is like someone who's really into like philosophy and like
Well, no,
the philosophy of law and
yeah, the impression that I'm given, or at least from afar, is like they're like Bond villains. Like that's how they're portrayed. It's like they're these diabolical figures over there in Budapest, you know. Like, oh
maybe,
man.
maybe. I mean, I definitely think the Bond villain's better than the soccer hooligan. Like
It's
in
fair.
Europe, we're kind of it's made out that they're like guys who are gonna like with skinheads that are gonna jump
Oh,
you
yes.
in the parking lot. But they're kind of no, it's kind of a bit of a philosopher king place, and it's kind of nice in that regard. But they're very thoughtful on the long term strategy of the country in a way
Yep.
that I don't think any other Western country is.
Yep.
And they'll go through some hard stuff. I have no doubt that you can't insulate yourself from, for example, the deindustrialization due to lack of
Yep.
energy in Europe. But I think that they'll be pretty sensible. There's a lot of nuclear power here as well. That's
Oh, cool.
very
Okay.
noticeable, and they're very pro nuclear power, and they're building
Wow.
two new
Let's go.
reactors at the moment. So I think by 2030 maybe we can become electricity exporters. Actually, we supply a lot of the electricity to Ukraine at the moment,
Yep.
despite them not being very nice to us. But
Oh, wow.
we're
Okay.
so generous and Christian that we
Yeah.
provide them with electricity. So all in all, I think it's a pretty good setup. But the one thing I'd say is it's just like there's no safer city in the West.
Yeah.
Budapest is just there's no crime. There's
Yep.
no crime. There's no like mass migration. It's just a really normal place, and
Yep.
it's I mean, if you haven't been here, look up the pictures online. It's one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with we're in like the age of the where philosopher kings are the philosopher king country. Those are scarce, and so part of value is scarcity. So right, so you've got Bukele in El Salvador, like he's been able to just like turn things around to staggering degrees. And again, there's concerns there from certain people about, oh, is he a dictator or whatever? But like, I mean, he violated the Constitution technically by taking a second term, but like all the people were like overwhelmingly like, you saved our lives, we're eternally grateful, please stay. So you got him, you got Orban, you got some of these other places, and I just think again it's going to be these places that have that are able to sensibly and quickly and decisively make decisions. These are going to be the places that are still going to be around, and where you have a bunch of you have decision paralysis because you've got all these institutions in place. Like it's just the bureaucracy is going to kill them. And so again,
Yeah, and the internal corruption.
yes,
When
yes,
you don't have strong leadership, people just grift and loot.
yes, exactly. Yep, 100%. So I guess I'll just finish with this. So I mean, we've kind of talked around Bitcoin a little bit. I've seen a number of your tweets about Bitcoin. Kind of, what is your overall thesis about Bitcoin? How do you think about it? Where do you think the future is going? We don't talk about price on this podcast, but like broadly speaking, what do you see? What are your thoughts about it?
Well, I'll just be honest. My concern is that Bitcoin seems to be correlated to the S&P.
Mm-hmm.
I own gold. I know you don't
Yep.
want to hear that,
Let's
but
go.
like
No.
I own
Listen.
gold because it's
Hold on.
uncorrelated.
I have to interrupt you. Like I am a gold appreciator, and there's a lot more overlap in appreciation between the gold people and the Bitcoin people than Peter Schiff would have you believe. So I will say that I think
I'm not a long-term gold bug. I
Yeah.
hold up my hand. When I was in financial markets, we all used to laugh at Peter Schiff and Ron Paul on the gold thing. But things have changed. The dollar is not going to be the reserve
100%.
currency for much longer.
Yep.
And the whole point and laugh at the gold guy was premised on there's no alternative to the dollar. Sorry, it's not that
Yep.
there's no alternatives. Complex dynamic. We could do an hour and a half on what's happening with the dollar.
Yep.
But the dollar is on its last legs as a reserve currency. Not saying it's
Yep.
going to collapse into hyperinflation. Not saying any of that. But
Nope.
things are coming.
Agreed.
And the Wall Street model is not long for this world.
Yep.
And I agree with all the Bitcoin people on that. But my concern is that it's become correlated to the S&P, and I know why it's become correlated to the S&P because it's in portfolios as a risk asset.
Yep.
I used to work in this.
Yep.
That doesn't mean that Bitcoin, that doesn't seal Bitcoin's fate as a technology. But
Yep.
what's happened with Bitcoin is it was initially set up as a monetary instrument and maybe a store of value.
Hmm.
and it became a risk-on asset,
Yep.
speculative asset for portfolio managers.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I think this is a big problem for the Bitcoin people. It's not their fault because
Yep.
they wanted it to resemble what gold actually currently is, which
Yep.
is uncorrelated hedge against society,
Yep.
against
Yep.
the dollar system, whatever you want to call it. But Bitcoin has become linked to the dollar system through this portfolio speculation,
Hmm.
and I mean, what else can I say? I don't want to be long Nasdaq,
Yep.
and right now it's correlated to. No, here's the question: will it always be correlated to Nasdaq?
That's
No,
where I
it's
was. That's
correlated to
where I would go.
Nasdaq for as long as people want to put it in the same risk basket as Nasdaq.
Yep.
But the guys on Wall Street do have it as a risk-on asset, and
Yep.
I don't know the Bitcoin response to that, but I am
Yeah.
telling you that is the reality because I know loads of these people
Yep.
who buy it on Wall Street and they see it as a risk-on asset. They see it as
Sure.
it rallies with the AI basket and stuff, and
Yep.
that's the concern that I have.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. Like right now, I mean that makes sense, but like it's just one of these things where is that the long term? Is that where it's going to be long term? And again,
No,
I think it
probably
makes sense
no.
to
If you put a gun
yeah
to my head, probably not. It's become
yeah
caught up in the current tech
sure.
bubble. That is
And
my
I would
concern.
100%, 100% agree. I still think like, again, if you look, I mean, the things that we do, I mean, the conversations that I have with gold bugs are basically just acknowledging some of the limitations of gold. So one of the examples, I was a church planter and missionary in Uruguay in South America for almost 7 years. And so half of our church members were Venezuelan immigrants. And so the gold served them no purpose. Like, cause a lot of these people had to flee the country walking across the border. There were thieves and governmentally sanctioned thieves, soldiers waiting who knew that these people were leaving with valuables. And so if they have like a bag of gold or silver, like it's not going to work for them. And so there's lots of places where they don't have a way to meaningfully secure gold or silver, but they do have like a cell phone where they can, and nobody knows that they have the Bitcoin. They can, there's wallets and different things. So I think that's obviously, that's millions of people. It's still not as big of pools of capital as these Wall Street firms and as, sovereign wealth funds from nations, all these kind of things. I think it's just a matter of maturity. Like this is, people are doing what makes sense to them. Bitcoin takes time to understand. Gold is much more straightforward. Again, gold, there's plenty of fraud that goes on with gold where it's tungsten wrapped in gold. And so you have to do more work to try to, guarantee that what you have is actual gold. And so again, none of this is like panacea versus, totally broke instruments. There's trade-offs with all of these things. And so it's going to take time for the broader market to understand, custodying Bitcoin, understand a lot of these things. But I do think that one of the drivers for Bitcoin's adoption is going to be and it actually is, this is happening, is Bitcoin with Bitcoin mining. Because you have basically Bitcoin mining allows you to turn stranded energy into money wherever it is. So where you have all these in inland China, you have a lot of these hydroelectric dams that are too far from the large population centers to efficiently transport the energy. And so what they're doing is, even despite the fact that China banned Bitcoin 7 times, they've banned Bitcoin 7 times and banned Bitcoin mining a number of times, China still has always been inside the top 5 of countries in terms of where mining activity is going on, because they can mine Bitcoin in these far-flung regions and then just transfer that Bitcoin to a regular population center. And so as that continues, as people understand that more and more, and people realize wait a second, this can actually make me more green. This can allow us to take energy that's currently being either burnt off with gas flaring or whatever. We can turn this into money to help us overcome some of our budget shortfalls. And then just the potential to do this, to apply Bitcoin mining to something like nuclear power. Those two things people are having at some of the highest levels. They're having these conversations and they're looking at Bitcoin differently than just a financial instrument as a risk on asset. And so I think it's going to take time. I think that we're still super early. You're talking about less than 1/4, I think, of 1% of global wealth is in Bitcoin. So it's basically a baby. And so, but I still think it's going to take time. But again, to your point, yeah, at this moment, there is correlation just between, people taking money and dumping it into Bitcoin. They're looking for something to give them, performance in a market where
I'll
everything else
tell
is
you
getting
exactly
killed.
what they're doing. I'll tell you because I know exactly what they're doing. They see it as a leveraged play on the stock market. So the beta on Bitcoin to the Nasdaq, I don't know what it is, but it's probably 2 or something like that. So for every
Yep.
2 points the Nasdaq moves, Bitcoin moves 4 points. Now, if you want to do the 2 times leverage on Nasdaq, you got to pay the piper, right? Because
Yep.
you're borrowing at the margin. You
Yep.
can get free
Yeah.
leveraged exposure to Nasdaq by buying coins.
Yep.
At the moment, that's pretty much what it's being used for in trader space. I know it because I mean I used to work in it and I know
Yep.
how people think. So it's,
Yep.
by the way, just if you want super details on this, the correlations aren't perfect, so you're getting the trade-off that you're trusting the beta rather than paying the piper on the margins.
Yep.
But it makes kind of sense. It's a pity it's been turned into that, but
Yep.
and it won't be that forever. I agree.
Yeah.
And anecdotally, I hear of more and more people using it for transactions, and I'm
Yep.
beginning to understand why they would start using it for
Yep.
transactions now. So
And this is, yeah.
I'm Bitcoin curious, I guess you'd say, but I'm here
Yeah.
clinging to my bags of gold coins and doubloons and stuff. So
See, that language of Bitcoin curious, I will put that under vice laws going forward in my philosopher kingdom. So, well, Phil, I really appreciate your time, man, and just again the conversation. I would love to have you back at some point in the future. We can kind of reevaluate and maybe just get more into the newer book. Again, we barely scratched the surface, but grateful for you. Tell people where they can find your work, and then just where they can find you and follow you online.
Most of it's on my Twitter at Philip Pilk, Philippilk, and I think I post pretty much everything I do up there. There's a lot of finance stuff, not a lot of Bitcoin stuff, but if you're interested in the end of dollar reserve hegemony and all that kind of stuff, like I don't want to say that I have one of the best accounts, but I think I do. I called the end of the dollar in March 2022, so
Yep.
a week after the invasion of Ukraine
Yep.
in American Affairs, so it's a
Yeah.
timestamped article.
Let's go.
So I've been very early on the dollar reserve thing.
Yep.
So if people are interested in developments on that, I think I follow it pretty closely. Among other stuff, geopolitical stuff as well, but the dollar stuff I'm very interested in.
Has anyone ever told you look like Brent Johnson?
I don't know who that is.
Brent Johnson is the dollar milkshake guy. You should look him up. He's pretty well known, and he's like been doing he's kind of like the opposite, where he's been saying, listen, yes, the dollar will someday crash because of these stupid policies, but in the meantime, the dollar's going to go way higher just by virtue of all the dollar denominated debt that's around the world and stuff like that. But you could be related.
He's a like finance commentator.
Yeah. He's Brent Johnson. Yeah, you should look him up. But anyhow,
maybe we're like twins separated.
Yeah, twins. He's the American version of you. Maybe there could be a history. You could check out your family demographics, and where maybe you guys are related to.
If we really look alike, that would be good. If he's pro dollar and I'm like anti or whatever, that would be good.
All right. Well,
that's a grift. That's a grift. Now there's a grift.
Well, man, hey, really appreciate you, and again, would love to have you back at some time in the future.
All right, thanks, Jordan. Have a good one. See ya. Bye.
All right, so let's see here. Hold on.